Welcome to another episode of It Depends podcast. Today, I'm honored to have the pleasure of hosting Satyen Sangani, who in 2012 created Alation and launched the data catalog category. 11 years later, Alation is now used by more than 30% of Fortune 100 companies for a number of use cases such as self-service analytics, data governance, and cloud migrations. Satyen, honored to have you on the show. Thank you for taking the time from your busy schedule and joining us.
Oh, this is great. Sanjeev, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I'm looking forward to a scintillating discussion. So I'm a big fan of, by the way, your Data Radicals podcast. It's extremely professionally done. This one, we're going to just roll and we're going to start with an introduction from your side.
Sure. So I guess, yes, I'm a podcast host. So I'm also the CEO of Alation and came to doing this because I guess I just saw a need in the market. I was working at Oracle for the better part of a decade and saw so many customers struggle with trying to get their data into a shape that would allow them to analyze and understand it. And I felt like that was a knowledge management problem. And so that's where we basically launched the catalog and built the data catalog space. And now I've been doing this for 10 years, and now we talk about ourselves as a data intelligence platform. But I think ultimately the goal is to try to just get more people to use data more actively. And, I kind of feel like if I can do that more with the rest of my career here and with this company, that's going to be a pretty successful thing to get after.
So specifically, what was the problem that you saw, or the gap you saw that was not getting filled in the market when you started Alation?
Yeah, I think essentially what happened is that data is produced as a byproduct of some software program for the most part, or some business process that's been built. And so it's produced in some system. Maybe that system is built by a third-party software vendor. Maybe it's even built internally by internal developers or SIs. But that process is one where often the people who are building the data or building the programs to produce the data don't necessarily either document it very well or describe the data very well. And so you've got all these people who are then coming along and consuming the data, and maybe the programmers or the documentation is long gone. And so you've got this gap where there's people who want to understand what's going on in the business and these business processes and how they're being affected by actual consumption and usage. And then there's a whole bunch of people who do understand it, but might not be there. And so I felt like there was a knowledge gap. And we saw that repeatedly in the financial services industry when I was at Oracle, where you'd have these old core banking systems that were, literally, scores of years old in many cases. And people just wouldn't want to understand what was going on inside of it. And so that to me felt like an opportunity. And I thought, oh, well, if it's a knowledge management problem, maybe we could do the same thing that people do on the internet with Wikipedia and Stack Overflow and build something similar for data.
Didn't you have a very interesting name for that product before it became Alation?
Well, one idea was to call it Rosameta, the Rosetta Stone of metadata. Yeah. And my co-founder, Aaron, at the time was like, that's like mixing something that is obscure with something nobody's ever heard of. And I don't want to be a part of a company who's going to have that kind of a name. And so, Aaron's obviously super witty and super thoughtful. And so he really liked the idea of having an A name. And then we went through a giant process while our two other co-founders were actually writing code and doing useful things. We sat in rooms thinking about what the company name should be, and ultimately came to Alation.
And I heard you have a user conference this year. You've been having it last year as well, called Revelation.
Yeah, so obviously lots of plays on words, but in this case, Revelation is intended to be it's intended to be a conference where the customers are able to meet with and speak to each other. I mean, obviously we'll do our requisite roadmap presentation and talk about where the company is going, but the real intention is sort of how can customers learn to build a data culture, and what are the impediments to doing that work, and what are the shared lessons, and what are the tactics. And we hold that conference, and we're seeing people come in every year. Those conferences are almost doubling in size. And so it's really great to see that.
That is amazing. So when you started the company in 2012 and you went through the name exercise, you knew the problem statement, and so you came up with this idea of a product. Did you call it data catalog at that time, or the term had not yet arisen? I'm just curious, what was it called?
Well, so my initial name for it was a data accessibility platform.
Oh.
Yeah, which was pretty horrible. And at the time, our head of marketing was a woman who, has been at a lot of data companies. Her name was Stephanie McReynolds, and she was like, "That's a really pretty horrible name." And we had talked a lot about what we should call the category. And ultimately, I had got some feedback from the guy who founded Unica, which was a customer data mastering company that I think ultimately was bought by IBM at the time. And he had said to me, a catalog is interesting. That's like, whatever you're describing seems interesting, but like, a catalog, that's like something that people need. And I think that really stuck because a catalog, kind of like an iPhone is so much more than a phone. And I think what we realized was you could make the name more complicated, like you could call it metadata management or data accessibility, but nobody knows really what those things are. And you go to a CEO and you say, do you need a metadata management platform? And many of them would be like, I know, like, what is that? I don't even know what metadata is. But you go to a CEO and say, do you need a catalog for all your data? And I'm quite certain that most would say, oh, don't we already have that? Shouldn't we have that? But of course we need that. And so for us, it was a mechanism of making something concrete that was otherwise really hard to access.
In Gartner, we actually called the Magic Quadrant metadata management because we couldn't figure out what's the right term. And in fact, my ex-colleague Mark Bayer used to love saying, "I never metadata I didn't like." So,
But
yeah. So I'm Satyan. I'm curious. There's metadata management. There's data catalog. Then you mentioned data intelligence platform. What is Alation's preference?
Yeah, I think so IDC has basically defined the space as being data intelligence, which is, as Stuart Bond would describe it, like getting intelligence about your data. And I like that because I think people know things like artificial intelligence and people know things like business intelligence, and know the companies in those spaces. And so the idea that you need intelligence about your data to power great reports and dashboards and great AI algorithms seems to me to be very tractable and approachable. And so that's, we've liked the IDC terminology and I think associate with that probably just because I think, very similarly, like, look, these are complicated concepts and everybody's confused about governance and metadata and PIIA. Like, there's all this stuff that people get really confused about. And I think often the names get in the way of comprehension. And so this idea of calling it something like, I think it's intelligence about your data. Like, I think most people can understand that, which is why we tend to like it.
So that is great. So moving aside from the naming convention, the general belief these days, I'm seeing a lot of posts on LinkedIn where people are saying that data catalogs have outlived their usefulness in this new so-called modern data stack. Some say it's static, it's out of band, it's not like in line with analytics. Some people say it's not a category by itself because it should really be embedded. What are some of the misconceptions about data catalogs and specifically about Alation?
Yeah, I think if you're a vendor, it's helpful. I mean, we're all competing for some level of the same budget. So I do think that there is a need to deposition something broadly defined. So if you're a privacy vendor, maybe you say, oh, the catalog's dead, privacy is what matters. And if you're a data quality vendor, you might say, well, long live observability, quality's dead. And so I do think there always has to be a paper straw man enemy. The idea that you need a catalog for your data, I think, is fairly unassailable. Like if somebody said, hey, catalogs are dead, I don't need a catalog for my data, I'm just going to have my data strewn all over the place and have nobody know where it is, I think that would be a pretty silly concept. So, I think obviously one wants to have people click on blogs and posts, but to me, that's just a very silly idea. I do think that the idea of a catalog, much like the idea of an iPhone, has evolved significantly. That the baseline use case is not just search and discovery, it's also data governance, it's also data ops, it's also being able to understand where to migrate the data and deal with operational workloads. And if you think about it that way, then it does have to service multiple masters. And I do think that it's important to be able to have a catalog that withstands multiple use cases. So there are cases where you're extracting metadata and pulling it from the system. There are cases where you have a stream where there's a real-time push of metadata as the underlying system gets updated. And I think your use case will drive which of those things you need. But I do think the definition of a catalog has expanded. And I think in some sense, maybe it's expanded so much in some cases that it might be too many things to too many people. The way I think about it is that a catalog is a UI for people to search for and discover data. And there are other things that are built alongside the catalog. The catalog, in fact, can be a platform for a whole bunch of other use cases. And so, in fact, our stated mission is to make the catalog the platform for data intelligence. And I think a lot of the primitives that exist in a catalog, connectors, object definitions, asset types, the UI and the search and discovery UI, filtering and collaborative filtering, like all these things are basic things that are part of catalog, but can be frankly reused for almost any type of data management or data intelligence tool. And so to me, the catalog is actually a very foundational thing with core centrality in making data management more efficient.
I completely agree. And I think this is the reason why we have so much confusion in the market. And so I want to ask you, like, how should a decision maker figure out what to get? Because like, let's say Tableau, BI tool, they came out with their own catalog just a few years ago. They originally didn't have one. ETL tools have it. If you're a security and privacy tool and you need to create policies, you need a catalog. So it seems like every tool, every product needs to discover the data, tag it, and make it searchable. Then you've got products like Alation, which is like a standalone data catalog. So going back to my question, how should a decision maker evaluate and figure out where should they look to get their catalog from?
Yeah. So I think the really critical thing that people often forget is that almost every data management tool has a catalog associated with it and has almost always had a catalog associated with it. So if you think about business objects, one of the oldest BI tools, they had this thing called a universe. A universe was nothing more than a catalog. It was a mapping layer and a data modeling layer, and it was the place where one would find dimensions and measures, and those dimensions and measures would be reused into the BI tool. And if you think about the Oracle database has a registry of schemas, which is called a catalog, not surprisingly. And so these things have existed for a really long time. And so the idea that Tableau was actually quite interesting, because Tableau basically said, we're going to give BI to the masses, and there was no common meta layer across any given set of Tableau workbooks. And Tableau came along and then reverse engineered a catalog and a set of data sources that can be reusable across their users, because what they ultimately realized was that otherwise you were creating chaos much in the same way that a spreadsheet would create chaos. So, from my perspective, there's going to be catalogs native to every data management system. And that's true of the cloud data management providers like Google Data Catalog or Amazon Data Zone. Those are going to be all specific built and purpose built for those platforms. And maybe they go beyond them, but broadly they'll be well suited for it. I think the real question is, do you need something that spans across all of those different estates? And that's really where an Alation gets involved, which is in a world where you've got data sitting all over the place, in a world with data products where you've got different people manufacturing different schemas and data sets and registries and repositories. How do you actually keep track of all of that stuff? And to me, having a single catalog is really the only answer to that question.
Yeah, which is what becomes even bigger when you go into things like data mesh, for instance. And so I want to ask you about these trends, like data mesh, for example. So I have a few of those I want to ask you about. And my question is, what's your view? Are these here to stay? Are these mostly hype? And what's the role of Alation, for example, in data mesh? Because one of the principles of data mesh is federated computational governance. How do you define that, and what is the role of Alation in the world of data mesh?
Yeah, so I think so you had Shabak on your your show, and I know, certainly I have on Data Radicals, and she's, I think, made a very simple observation, which is that historically we've thought about data management as an exercise in centralization. That, one should build a single source of truth. And, even to this day, I hear so many people say, well, we need a single source of truth for this. And, the idea that there can be a single source of truth, like that's a Platonic ideal, like philosophically, like one hopes that could exist, but in practice, that's extraordinarily hard because truth, is constantly evolving and changing, and that's the very nature of science. And so I think Zhamak's observation quite simply was, look, one actually was going to have data all over the place, and there is not going to be centralization. And so your actual data is going to live in different places. The compute associated with that data that manufactures that data is going to live in different places. And the level of governance that one needs for any given data set may be at different levels of fidelity, because you might need to govern, for example, reg reporting far more than you might need to govern data that comes off of a sensor system for a retail store. And so if one then says, okay, the world is going to be decentralized, then I think this concept of data mesh is just so deeply powerful, because I think it allows people to give up the ghost on having to control and centralize and just like have an iron fist around all of this data that otherwise people would use incorrectly. And I think it's a very it's a Sisyphusian way of approaching the exercise, because you'll never get control of the data. And why would you ever want to? On some level, what you want to be able to do is get the best data to the best people at the best possible level of quality at all times. But that's a permanent exercise, not a one-time thing. And I think data mesh allows for that sort of thinking. And I think that's why it's really powerful.
I see. So that's actually very interesting the way you put it, because what you're saying is that decentralization is a natural order of this universe. Centralization is not. Like, we're decentralized by nature.
I think there's, I think neither reality has truth. Or both realities have truth. I mean, I think, look, like we are internally at Alation, we've got NetSuite, we've got Salesforce. We also have our own internal customer systems that feed off product telemetry data. And if you think about that, like just the very simple question of like, what's the customer record and how do these things map across each other? Like the legal entity that we're billing out to is different from the, opportunity entity that we have in Salesforce. Like that's a common problem. And one does need a customer master, and one does need centrality and centralization. And I do think that you can build these centralized products and they can be quite important and useful. I think the idea that there's a single central thing that contains all your master data and all of your dimensional data and all of your metrics, I think that's quite destructive. And so I do think there's a role for centralization and commonality. I just think that one has to relax their view on how that should exist.
Okay. I can see that, because I think the world cannot be binary, centralized, decentralized. It's got to be hybrid, because you got to have a common customer record identity, like the golden record. Otherwise, billing is going to one place and the product is getting shipped to a different person, maybe, so we can't have that, right? So there's certain things like customer master, there should be a single source of truth. Would that be okay?
I think that's right. And I think then even within that single source of truth, one would recognize that that's not a static thing, but a dynamic thing, that you would want to obviously change that over time. And if new systems are onboarded where you need customers to be linked in, you want that to be something that's a living artifact, as I think most, good MDM initiatives would be. But I think that recognition of change is really critical. And whether it's centralized or decentralized, the big thing is, look, this stuff is constantly changing, and it should. And what we want is to have change. Like, we talk a lot about complexity. Like the cloud is accelerating the level of complexity in the world, because now anybody can fire up a workload and anybody can build an app. And anybody can go buy and swipe a credit card to build and buy a new SaaS application. And if one thinks about all of this data that gets produced as an offshoot of these activities, that's awesome. Like that's just an incredible freedom to people who want to solve problems and create solutions to things. And yet, and we would never want to restrict that, and we would want to learn from those activities. And so to me, then the question is, okay, well, in that kind of a world, how do you deal with this complexity? And the answer is, I think, to constantly track and monitor the change, and to constantly enable the people who are doing that work of creating the change to register the knowledge that they have so others can find and discover it.
I love what you're saying, because this is exactly what I've been deep into researching, except I'm calling it, from Jean-Marc's data mesh concept, a data product.
Yeah.
So is that something that, like, Alation is also looking into data products, and what are your views about data products?
Well, I think in some level, we haven't called it a data product, but we actually have that idea in terms of what I would call a data object. So a report is a data product, and a ETL is a data product, and a AI model is a data product. And those products, I think the word product is really powerful, right? Because a product has a beta version, and a V1, and a V2, and a V3, and a V7, and an end of life, right? And I do think that that's true for physical products in the world, software products, and also data products as well. And it gives you a frame to think about, like, does this thing need to be anything less than a V or more than a V1, or can it just be that, right? And if one thinks about governance, well, governance is a thing that actually increases the robustness, just like a V2 might. And so we do think about this idea of data products, and the idea of versioning objects exists in the context of Alation. Data assets exist, and data assets can be thought of as, I think, synonymous to a data product on some level. Like governance professionals call them data assets. I think obviously analytics professionals often call them data products, but I think they're roughly the same thing, and super helpful as an artifact to think about, like, the world that way.
And what is a relationship to all of these topics we're talking about, data mesh, data products, with data ops? You had mentioned data ops a few minutes ago. What is the connection?
Yeah, so I think the core of data ops is the genesis is from this idea related to DevOps, right? And so in the world of software development, you have this idea of continuous integration, continuous deployment, and what you're trying to do is build an iterative team to constantly keep up with change and needs and new requirements and the like, and to be able to have speed in your development cycle. The idea of data ops, I think, is very similar. You want to be able to take it up and down infrastructure, constantly modify transformations and extractions, and you want to be able to also modify reporting artifacts quite efficiently and quickly, and so that you can get to a world where it's not a waterfall method of development, but it's a lot more continuous and agile, right? And so data ops is, I think, the new version of a BI or ETL engineer, where those people previously might have been building against static requirements or requirements that were quite fixed, and now need to move into a world where there's a lot more evolution. So I think those are there, and one could argue what the end of that work is, that they're developing versioned data products, whether it's a transformation or a data movement or a report.
So Satyen, as we develop version data products and we do automation, orchestration, all of these things that fall under data ops, how does Alation sort of change or grow to handle data ops? And what's the connection between data intelligence platform and data ops?
Yeah, so I think the core of what we do is drive engagement and adoption with these data objects, with these data products in a customer's landscape. And so there are lots of use cases, for example, around tracking compute consumption that Alation does a little bit of and has a little bit of, or for example, tracking privacy requirements, where all of these things are things that one might use in order to sort of describe the data, where we may not necessarily fulfill or build a first-party application. And so I think data ops is very similar. There are some cases where, for example, with lineage of stored procedures or lineage against, mainframe COBOL-based systems, we might not necessarily get into that flow, but that's a critical use case for a company that might want to move into the world of data ops. And so we believe that we're the collaboration platform and the search and discovery platform for every user. And you need one of them. You can't have 5 places that people are collaborating. Otherwise, somewhat definitionally, they're actually not collaborating, right? If you have like a tool for the engineers independent from the tool for the analyst, like how does that exactly work when they need to talk to each other? So we believe that what we do is we provide sort of that collaborative platform and that engagement platform. But often what we're trying to do is supplement that or complement that with integrations from data observability systems. And we have an open data quality initiative that allows people to plug in their own data quality tools or third-party data quality tools. Data access management tools are another example. Master data management tools are another example. And we believe that that becomes the sort of coordination plane for these various applications and use cases.
Since you mentioned buyers, so I'm curious, who is the target persona for Alation? Also, how has buying patterns changed over the last few years? Are the buyers more technical or business folks, centralized, decentralized? What's going on in the market?
Yeah, so in our early days, we found that we were selling primarily to analytical teams. And so often it would be a head of analytics that could have been a director or a VP, or sometimes it would be even more senior. I think only of late has the CDAO title come to be in existence, but that was certainly early. And often that would be a department within a company or a business unit within a company, but maybe not the entire business. I think certainly the buying behavior has become much more centralized, where people view these in the enterprise segment as enterprise projects where they'd like to roll out the capability to, some group of people, whether it's in the scores or hundreds, or, more often it's in the hundreds or the thousands in their aspiration. We sell generally to the chief data officer or the chief data analytics officer. Sometimes that's the head of data who also owns the infrastructure. Sometimes that person is only responsible for the data, with the infrastructure being owned by the IT teams. Sometimes we're still selling into the business, where you're selling into, the marketing analytics organization, where they have a particular need. And I think it really depends on the scale and the shape of the business. How I think it's changed is that I think 5 or 6 years ago, there was this question of like, why should I even buy a catalog, and do I need one? Is this a feature, or is this a need? Is this a painkiller, or is it a vitamin? I think now there is pretty clear recognition that you need a sort of central capability to manage your data, or to at least have intelligence about your data. That seems to be a pretty well-known thing. So I think it's now no longer whether I should buy one, but which one should I buy? And I think those have been the changes that I've seen in the buying patterns and behavior.
That is very interesting, because I've been, like, as I look into data mesh and we become more domain driven, and each domain, so marketing is responsible for creating a data product for, let's say, the marketing use cases, and then for, like, they're running campaigns and stuff like that. So they have an idea about who the prospect or the customer is. The salespeople are selling to the same people. Finance people are handling billing. So the confusion I have sometimes in my mind is, there's going to be a common business glossary, a common definition of a customer, right? But they may define it differently. For a finance person, a definition of a customer may be, is it a paying customer or discounted? I mean, there could be any number of definitions. So in this decentralized, domain-driven, how do you have a common glossary and common policies that should be executed? Who does that?
Yeah, I think ultimately that has to grow up. I mean, there's a little bit of top down there, and there's obviously a little bit of bottom up, in the sense that if you have a data product, or if you had a set data product, those things are going to come with their own associated metadata and definitions, and those definitions are inherent in the calculations. So if you have a data product that calculates churn, well, what's the definition of churn? It's the calculation that's implicit within the data set and the compute.
Yeah.
So you might have then multiple data assets which have churn referred to within them, and they may not all necessarily be the same, and maybe purposefully so. Maybe, calculating for the finance, you might do it on a revenue basis, and doing it in the world of support, you might do it on a ticket basis. And so it's, there may be necessary differences in these calculations. I think it's important, obviously, at the point of collaboration across teams and departments, that you do have that difference established, especially if you're going more and more up in the organization, as you're doing cross-functional things, as you're doing strategic initiatives across an organization. And so I do think that's where a business glossary gets into play. Your software shouldn't, by the way, stand in the way of any of this. Like, you should be able to have churn defined bottom up, and churn defined top down, and you should be able to map them in an appropriate way. And I think what you want in an organization is to be able to sort of, in very same way like you refactor software, like you build a lot of software, and then what you find is that you have to every so often refactor it because there is a whole new set of requirements that have come about over time that you realize, oh, well, now the architecture has to change. I don't think that's very different for business glossary terms. Like you have to actually sort of constantly look across your landscape, figure out what's serving you, and promote that, and build commonality and definition commonality, and get the right teams together to collaborate and do that in the traditional way that people do data governance. On the flip side, you should also find the old stuff that no longer serves you and deprecate it and get rid of it. And that's a living process. And I think goes back to the change points that I had mentioned earlier.
I see. Got it. Okay, very interesting. These are all the thinking that's kind of developing as we start tackling more complexity within an organization. So talking about complexity within an organization, that leads me to this question that is also, I think, super important, and it has to do with adoption of data catalogs. So, we all talk to companies that have tried to do data governance multiple times, have not succeeded over the years. In fact, sometimes they don't even want to hear the word data governance ever mentioned in a meeting. It just brings up trauma. So the question is, why is it so hard to adopt data governance in general or data catalogs in particular?
I think, honestly, there's a presumption in the world of data management that if you organize it or have enough features or have enough capabilities, that people will just like use the data and that they'll just come. And to me, that's like, that's kind of the one of the misconceptions. I mean, you talked about misconceptions around data catalogs. I think there's a misconception around data in general. Like, the world broadly doesn't actually operate off of data as much as it ought to. I mean, if you think about the long chain of reports that get built in, Tableau is a phenomenal partner of ours, but most of these technologies, and within Tableau, like, many reports are built that just don't get ever used. And I, on my podcast, had Professor Paul Leonardi, who did work on technology adoption. 80% of the technology that gets built, every 80% of the time that you buy technology, you only use the actual technology in 20% of its capabilities. So often what ends up happening is people think that they're building something that people will use. People don't actually use this stuff. And so to me, the more pernicious problem, the more important problem is, and the hard problem, right? The really tough problem that I think our users, our customers are trying to solve is, how do we get people to use data more consistently? How do we get people to think more empirically? How do we build a culture where we get people to use data more often? And yes, that is basically a hard problem. And I think that's what people mean. Like, we want people to adopt the catalog. They don't want people to adopt the catalog. Like, that's like, who cares about whether you're using a catalog or not? What people care about is, are people using data to make good decisions? And whether a catalog is in that process or not, I think it's a huge catalyst for that. But I think really the challenge that they're truly articulating is, we want data to be adopted by more people so we can run better as a business. And to me, that's the hard problem that we're deeply focused on. And I think catalogs are a very important part of solving.
That is really well put. I really like it. It's like, catalog or no catalog, we need to get value from our data. So, and use it meaningfully, use it to make decisions, which, if you're not doing that, then it doesn't matter whether there's a catalog in the picture or not. Satyen, what are some of the core use cases that your customers are using Alation for?
Yeah, so I think the most important one, honestly, is the core of what we just talked about, which is search and discovery.
Yeah.
If I can't find something, how do I ever even consider thinking about using it? And so search is a hard problem, right? Google could always be slightly better. And certainly with ChatGPT, you see how much innovation that there still remains to be done in the world of search and discovery. So search and discovery is, I think, the primary use case, and I think the one that we'll always try to be making better and will be working on. Certainly data governance is the other part of that. I mean, if one thinks about search and discovery, the one side of the coin is search, but search is informed by great context. If you have something really well described, it's going to be a lot easier to find it. And so certainly in a very broad way, one can think about data governance as a mechanism of surrounding the data with context and, obviously as well controls too. And so data governance is probably the second, or I would say second. I think they're very complementary use cases. Like I actually don't think about cataloging and governance as being very different things. I think about them being the same thing, because if you want to discover data, then it's going to have to be well documented and controlled. And so those are, I think, two sides of the same coin. Certainly there are other use cases like data privacy and compliance that fall off of both of those use cases that we service and will deal with. We obviously partner with lots of data quality vendors, with master data management vendors. Data transformation and data operations tends to be a use case that tends to be pretty critical and important to what we do. So those are the cores. And I think what you would find is that there's a lot of bleed within these use cases, right? Like these are historically people have said like, you need a data quality tool and a MDM tool and a data catalog. And then you should cut up these things and look at an RFI with features for every single one of these things. And the reality is like, that's actually not how people think about these things. Like not the business users that are actually using the technology. They just are like, look, I want to use data. Can you please get me the data? And they don't care about this word metadata. It doesn't matter to them, and it shouldn't. Did I lose you?
Yeah, no, I'm right here.
Okay.
Sorry, became really quiet. So yeah, no, absolutely. I think we could.
Brilliant.
So, another use case I've seen Alation use for is cloud migration. How big is that use case, and what is the role of Alation in that cloud migration?
Yep. So one of the things that we do is we crawl cloud data sources and obviously discover the schemas within those data sources. We obviously have always done that with on-premise data sources as well. Often when customers are doing migrations from their on-premise estate to the cloud, they have very simple questions, which is, how do I get to migrate those users and know which data sets they're using? And so one of the things that we do is by inspecting the logs of the underlying databases like Oracle or MySQL or DB2, we can understand how data is being used and which data sets are being used most often. Those then become the candidates to move data over into the cloud. Somewhat similarly, what you find is that when the data is in the cloud, often people don't want to pay for the data storage or for unused compute. And so then the question becomes, well, how do I make sure that I'm using this infrastructure in an optimal way? And that use case actually was an early use case. We actually built an application very early in our evolution, which was called Forensics. And we ended up ultimately retiring that application. More recently, now that we've partnered with Snowflake and to a lesser extent Databricks, we've been seeing that customers really love this use case, because as we are sold on top of those platforms and those infrastructures, everybody wants to know what's the right data to put into Snowflake, what's the right data to put into Databricks, what's the right data to put into Redshift, and therefore, how do I discover that? You discover that using Alation.
Some of these things that you're explaining, the understanding the usage of products, reminds me of data observability. Would you say like there's an overlap with data observability tools in this?
There is. I think there's certainly a bit of an overlap. I mean, by inspecting the query logs and by generating the lineage graph, that's something that an observability vendor might do, perhaps for the same systems or even different systems. I think there's honestly room for a lot of these problems to get solved. And one of the reasons why we think about this as a platform is we want to be open. We want to make sure that other vendors can populate our metadata graph appropriately and fully. And there's so much dimensionality to the description of data. I mean, arguably infinite. So, we would want to partner with other vendors to do exactly that work. And so, yes, we do a little bit of observability. We don't market ourselves as an observability vendor. What I find interesting about that space actually is that even within the quality and observability world, the amount of variation and heterogeneity between the tools themselves is actually quite significant. And so one of the things that we found is that they're not all the same. Some do rules-based quality management, some generate the rules completely. Some don't have rules at all and use sort of AI and neural nets in order to be able to assert the quality. And so it's a very different landscape. And I think from our perspective, great, because we can sort of take metadata from anywhere.
And you partner with many of these companies. I've seen that you have the data quality initiative.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about that? Because I love what you're saying is that there are different products for different needs. So by creating this framework, you probably are able to capture different types of companies, partners. Is that right?
That's exactly right. I think that there is often what you find is that people buy tools for themselves and forget about the outcomes that they're trying to buy for. So, you find people are like, well, I need to go manage my data. Well, how do I do that? Well, I got to go get a data glossary, and I've got to go do data governance, and I've got to go buy a data cataloging tool, and then I've got to go get some quality. And it tends to be a very functionally based view. And then you sit down and you say, well, why are you doing any of this? And, well, sometimes it's like, well, because I got told to by my boss because data is important, or, we have to comply with this initiative that we have to go deal with, or this regulation, or we really want people to use data more actively. And I think what we observe within the space is that actually making the narrower claim leads to far more success than trying to be all things to all people. And so from our perspective, what we focus on is engagement and adoption with data. That's like all we do. That's what we care about. If you don't want your data engaged and adopted, maybe we're a good platform for you, but we might not be. But what we really think about then is like, what are the real needs that you have in order to service that? Sometimes it is quality, sometimes it is access management and control. But I think one wants to be thoughtful about that, because this is not a space where one product is going to fit every particular need. And so I think that's why we have a very particular view about how we market what we do, because it's very outcomes based.
That is great. In fact, I got reminded of a podcast I did recently with Ben Stansel, co-founder of Mode, and I was asking him like, what seems like BI is kind of not as fast moving as many other spaces. What would it take to take BI to the next level? And I was amused to hear his answer. He was saying that BI is used by the end users, business users, the analysts, to run queries and visualize data. But there's a whole set of data producers who don't use the BI tool. And he sees there's a whole scope of people using BI tools who are producers of data. And now I'm thinking the same thing could hold true even for data catalog, right? So we do self-service analytics, which is a very departmental business unit job. But what if even a data engineer goes to the catalog? Do you see that happening?
Absolutely. And I think that's exactly what should be happening.
Okay.
I think this idea that there's tools for the engineers and then there's tools for the business people, I think data is a language around which one can understand the world. And if you're a CDO or a CEO, your job is to get your people to speak the same language. And I think what the tragedy of the space is that the people often that are buying this stuff are the technical folks, and often they're optimizing for their own needs and uses. But that doesn't necessarily solve the macro problem, which is how do we get everybody to use the data more appropriately and well, and how do we collaborate around it? How do we use it as a mechanism to build shared truth? So yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think the idea that you have all these different tools that are sort of fragmented, I think just kind of promotes this Tower of Babel problem that really is at the heart of what we're all trying to solve.
I see. Yeah, my biggest takeaway from this podcast is a reminder that even like data products, if I talk to a business user and say, oh, guess what, we're going to build you a data product, they'll be like, okay, so what? You can call it whatever you want. Am I going to get quality data, timely data, secure? That's what they care about. They don't care what we end up calling it. So we need to remind ourselves, IT people, of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we live it so deeply and understand it so well. And there's so many of us who have spent our lives in this stuff, but then there's so many people that just haven't, and just want to do the right thing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And talking about, serving the community, I noticed recently there were two announcements. I'd love to hear your views. One was enabling spreadsheets to connect with Alation, and the second was Marketplace. Can you talk about these two?
Yeah. So spreadsheets, probably the most commonly used database BI tool and ETL tool, frankly. I mean, if you think about it, right? I mean, it's all three.
Yes.
And people say they do data management, but then of course they do some of their most critical reporting off of spreadsheets. And those spreadsheets are often totally disconnected from anything having to do with governance. And so it's almost like, you have a home and you've insulated every part of the house, but then you've got a giant gaping hole in your front door. Like, okay, well, that's great, but all the air is flowing out the front door. And so you're not really actually protecting anything. And I think spreadsheets are, really similar. Like they're broadly used. They're loved. I don't think that you're going to take them out of anybody's hands. If you try to take spreadsheets out of my hands, that would be I challenge you to do that. I think it would be, so they're great tools. What we did with Connected Sheets is we basically said, look, we just need to make the spreadsheet connect to the rest of your governed estate. And so what we've done is basically build adapters to things like, and a connectivity to things like Microsoft Excel 365 and also G Sheets. And now you can take data directly from, for example, Snowflake and get it into one of those spreadsheets and ultimately write data back. And that becomes something that you can track lineage around and govern. And now you can make those spreadsheets discoverable, which are all things that you would obviously want to do. But no data management tool has done that to date. So that's been something that's been super exciting for me because it, again, broadens the number of people who can access and understand and leverage data. It doesn't have to be the SQL literates or the Python literates. Beyond that, and the second one I forgot which one you were. Marketplaces. So I think this is, look, I think we're in the very early innings of a data economy. I think that data will be ultimately transacted upon, just like any other content might be. And so one should be able to find data about the world that isn't produced inside the walls of my company, whether that's census data, whether that's temperature data or weather data, whether that's retail traffic data, which are use cases that are happening today. But if you want to learn about the world around you, ideally you just want any data that might be available. And so if you could, for example, subscribe to other people's data that might be de-anonymized, or you might want to discover other data that might help you figure out whether or not to make an investment in a certain region or territory or market. Those are all things that I think can be quite powerful. And so what we've done with Alation Marketplaces is basically turned Alation on and the search and discovery within Alation on, not to just the internal data set within a company, but also to third-party data that might reside on Snowflake's data marketplace or Amazon's data marketplace, or even ultimately through third parties. And so that is what we've done there. And I think that's going to only grow over time to be a richer and richer part of our business.
What are some examples, if I may ask, of some partners?
Yeah, so certainly, within, for example, the Snowflake data marketplace, you've got data sellers like Dun & Bradstreet, for example, who might sell data around credit or who might sell data around company demographics. And so those are, and then you might want that information to be able to figure out if you're trying to prospect into a certain set of customers, what their credit characteristics might be and whether one market might not be better than another. And so that would be one very good example. You could see other examples in terms of healthcare data sets and just real world data about demographics and being able to figure out what organic profiles that individuals might have in order to be able to describe whether or not drugs could be useful to treat a certain set of populations or a certain set of individuals.
So when we look at all this data, it's growing exponentially. We've got data from internal sources, external sources. But if we look at metadata, I hear two schools of thought. One says that metadata size is very small compared to data. But another school of thought is that the metadata is actually growing faster because there's so much metadata about each column, each value, its quality, its usage, telemetry, and so on. So what is what is your view? Is metadata ever going to exceed the size of actual data?
I think it's a continuum. I mean, on some level, any chart or report or data, like when you're generating,
Yeah.
you have a column in, let's say you're in Tableau, and you've got a metric, and that metric is gross margin. And you've got gross margin over time. And you say, I now want to sum the gross margin column over time, and I want to be able to come up with an average. Is that data or is that metadata? Like any descriptive statistic, I think on some level is both the data and metadata. So I think one of the, like one gal's data is another person's metadata on some level. And so I think about it. So I think the both are going to expand quite a bit. And I think the idea, and you want one place to store that metadata, which is relevant to search and discovery and governance, so that you can then shoot off to the system where you might manipulate the data or further analyze it or understand it or generate more of it or whatever it is that you want to do. So I do think about this graph as being one that's constantly growing, but it doesn't necessarily have to grow in the four walls of a single database. Like there's always going to be metadata that exists, and some of it you'll store locally, some of it you'll store centrally, and kind of like the data mesh product idea, it'll vary over time.
Do you see your customers already asking about ChatGPT? Is there any plans of integrating ChatGPT?
Absolutely. I mean, we do see it, and obviously are playing around with it quite a bit. I think there's a whole bunch of fun use cases. One of which is allowing users to generate queries leveraging English, and that's something that we had invested in with our Lingo acquisition about a year ago. There's also use cases on just generating descriptives, profiles of data sets. So if you sort of read a profile, could you start translating the description of that data set into English so that now somebody searching for the information could be more useful? So those are some very primitive use cases and first order use cases. I think over time you could see even second order use cases where people leverage the metadata to generate reg reports or even generate rich descriptions of how the data is being used. So there's some really fun stuff that I can think will be done over time, and it's just super exciting to see.
I think so. I cannot wait for the day where the ChatGPT kind of a generative AI is trained on my metadata, my data catalog.
Yeah.
And now I can ask all kinds of questions in a chat form. I mean, that just sounds very transformative.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So we are getting very close to the end. I can go on for a long time asking you questions, but I want to start wrapping it up. But a very important question I'd like to ask people on my show is to share their experiences, their lessons learned, their journey for people who are listening. What are some nuggets of knowledge that you would like to share with the listeners?
Yeah, it's an interesting time in the world of technology. I mean, if you look at most SaaS companies, most software companies, there's a realignment, I think, within the investor population and the employee population, the founder population, the executive population around what one can expect. Like, the perks are lower, there was obviously layoffs in companies and that kind of thing. I think that the important thing is to at least the thing that I've learned is that there's a lot of obviously projection of how perfect things are, but at least in my personal experience, whether with this problem and with this company is, well, I think our outward success has been amazing and more than I ever could have hoped for. This stuff is a real grind. And, you just wake up every morning, and this is really just purely personal and advice. It's just have the opportunity to work hard on something that you care about. As one of my board members once said, every life has problems, and a life full of good problems is a good life. And so I do think that there's a lot to be learned from that. So I think, as an entrepreneur and as a leader, I think not trying to project that everything's always awesome and everything's always perfect, I think is a real service to the world right now, where we're all consumed with everybody else is perfect. And so certainly I'll be, hopefully one of the first in line to tell you that stuff's hard, and you just got to work every day to do something that you think is valuable.
Yeah, we all in it together.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. One last question. Tell us something interesting about you that the world generally does not know.
Um, I don't know. There's a my So my son often will. My kids will often say words, and whenever they say the words, I'm going to think like I somehow have some random metadata association between individual words and then songs that happen. And so I just start like breaking out into songs, and then like my wife's like, "Oh, like Rohan, you broke dad again." So I guess I have a skill for random association between lyrics and
Ironically, I have
words.
the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like my kids will say some word, and I'll be like, "Oh, that reminds me of this song," but I don't sing. That's the only difference. Because if I sang that, then that'd be a bigger problem.
I don't think people would call what I do singing either, but it doesn't seem to stop me. So for sure.
That is great. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation to get a peek into your mind about all these important topics. So thank you so much for coming to this.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.